The fire engines were still a distant scream when I saw her. It was 3:17 in the morning, according to the unblinking red digits on my microwave. I was standing at my kitchen window, a mug of rapidly cooling coffee in my hands, watching the orange glow paint the underside of the clouds. My barn, the old beautiful silver-gray barn that had sold me on this property, was devouring itself from the inside out. Flames licked through the roof timbers, reaching for the stars like desperate, grasping fingers. It was a terrible, mesmerizing sight. And there she was, Eleanor Vance, standing on the edge of my lawn, just shy of the property line, her silhouette stark against the inferno. She had her phone to her ear, a familiar pose for her. She was the president of our homeowners association, a role she inhabited less like a neighbor volunteering for a thankless job, and more like a warlord presiding over a newly conquered territory. The glow of the fire illuminated her face in pulsing demonic waves. I couldn't hear her words, not over the roar and crackle of 100-year-old wood surrendering to heat. But I could guess. Her posture told the whole story. The righteous angle of her head, the stabbing motion of her free hand, the way she paced the demarcation between the community's manicured grass and my slightly wilder acre. She was performing. She was always performing. I opened my back door and stepped onto the porch. The heat washed over me, smelling of history and hay and something acrid and chemical. I took a sip of my coffee. It was bitter. The first fire engine, a massive ladder truck, thundered past my house and swung into position, its lights strobing a chaotic rhythm across the scene. Firefighters, looking like astronauts from another world, spilled out and began their methodical dance of hoses and axes. Through it all, Eleanor kept talking. Another neighbor, Mr. Henderson from 2 doors down, came out in his bathrobe. He started towards Eleanor, but she waved him off with an imperious flick of her wrist, never breaking her monologue. She was on official business. A sheriff's deputy's car pulled up, and a young officer got out. Eleanor immediately descended upon him. Now I could hear her. Her voice, a sharp, piercing instrument she used to carve up board meetings, cut through the din. "It's arson, officer," she declared, loud enough for me to hear clearly from 50 yards away. 100%. You need to talk to him. She pointed a long accusatory finger directly at me, standing on my own porch, in my own pajamas, holding my own coffee mug. Hay's been nothing but trouble since he moved in. Hay's been fighting with the association. He probably did it for the insurance money. This is highly, highly suspicious. The deputy, a kid who looked like he was still renting his first apartment, had the expression of a man who'd been called out to a barking dog complaint and found himself in the middle of a Shakespearean drama. He looked at the raging fire, then at Eleanor's contorted face, then at me. I didn't move. I didn't wave. I just met his gaze and gave a slow, deliberate nod. I took another sip of coffee. The deputy said something to Eleanor, probably some placating murmur, and started walking towards me. Eleanor wasn't done. "You need to secure the scene," she shrieked after him. "Hay's probably destroying evidence right now. That is what they do." The young deputy reached the bottom of my porch steps. He had that wary, carefully neutral look that all public servants develop after about 6 months on the job. "Sir," he began, "I need to ask you to—" "I know," I said, my voice quiet but clear. "Stay here, don't go inside, don't touch anything, I'm the owner. My name is Arthur Pendleton. I was asleep, the smoke alarm in the barn is wired to the house. It woke me up. I called 911 at 3:14 a.m. The call log will confirm it." He blinked. I had answered his first 4 questions before he'd had a chance to ask them. He looked back at Eleanor, who was now trying to direct the firefighters. They were, to their infinite credit, completely ignoring her. He looked back at me. "Okay, Mr. Pendleton, can you just stay right here for me?" "I wasn't planning on going anywhere," I said, gesturing with my mug at the spectacle. "It's the best show in town." Some time later, as the fire was being tamed from a roar to a sullen, steaming hiss, another man arrived. He wasn't a firefighter or a police officer. He wore heavy-duty boots, canvas pants, and a jacket with County Fire Marshal embroidered on it. He was older, with a graying crew cut, and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite and then left out in the sun for 20 years. He conferred with the fire chief and the deputy, his eyes methodically scanning the entire scene, the charred skeleton of my barn, the soaked ground, the exhausted firefighters. Eleanor, still on the porch, on my second cup of coffee. Finally, he started walking my way. Eleanor, sensing a more important audience, tried to intercept him, launching into her now-rehearsed speech about my supposed motives and litigious nature. He listened, his face giving away nothing. He didn't interrupt her. He just let her run out of steam, like a child having a tantrum. When she finally paused for breath, he simply said, "Thank you for your statement, ma'am," and continued walking towards me. Leaving her standing there with her mouth half open, he had just nullified her. It was a beautiful thing to watch. He stopped at the foot of my steps, his gaze taking in the coffee mug, my calm demeanor, the fact that I hadn't even bothered to put on shoes. "Arthur Pendleton?" he asked. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble. "That's me," I said. "Marshal Thompson," he said, not offering a hand, just a title. "I'm going to have a lot of questions for you." "I'm sure you will," I replied. "And I will answer every single one of them. But you should know, Marshal, that woman." I nodded my head towards Eleanor, who was now glaring at us. "Has just done me an incredible favor. She has, on the record to a uniformed officer, and likely to a 911 dispatcher, established a narrative of my guilt, a motive, a character assessment. She has planted her flag firmly, publicly, and irrevocably on the hill of my culpability." Marshal Thompson's expression didn't change, but a flicker of something of curiosity, confusion, passed through his eyes. I leaned forward slightly, my voice dropping. "She has no idea that the fire isn't the story. The fire is just the catalyst. She thinks this is the end of her problem with me. But she just handed me the one thing I was missing to solve my problem with her. An actionable event with significant damages. She has no idea what she's just started. But before I tell you what I did next, before I explain the folders and the files and the slow, methodical process that followed, you have to understand the 5 years that led to that night. You have to understand the nature of peace and the price of it. I bought this house, the one with the old barn, 5 years ago. My wife, Martha, had passed away the year before. Our life together had been lived in a neat suburban box, in a city 2 states away. It was a good life, a full life, but the house was haunted by her absence. Every room, every chair, every damn throw pillow was a memory, end quote. I needed a new place. A place with no memories, a place where I could build my own quiet. I am a structural engineer by trade, or I was. I spent 40 years investigating. Failure buildings that collapsed, bridges that buckled, foundations that cracked. My job was to read the story that steel and concrete told after they had given up. It teaches you a certain kind of patience. It teaches you that every catastrophe has a long and detailed prologue. You just have to know how to read it. This place was perfect. A solid, if unremarkable, ranch house on a 1-acre lot at the very end of a cul-de-sac. It was part of a planned community, the Meadows at Whispering Creek, a name that promised a rustic tranquility it didn't quite deliver. But my acre was different. It backed onto a wooded conservation area, and it had the barn. The realtor had called it a potential liability. I saw it as a cathedral of hand-hewn beams and silent history. It would be my workshop, my sanctuary, the place I'd finally restore that old 1957 Porsche I had had. Under a tarp for a decade, it was the reason I paid the asking price, without haggling. For the first year, it was exactly the piece I'd been looking for. I kept to myself. I waved to the neighbors. I started the slow work of clearing out the barn. Then, Eleanor Vance was elected president of the HOA. Eleanor wasn't from here. She and her husband had moved in a few years before me. They bought the biggest house on the block, the executive model. She was a force of nature, a whirlwind of manicured nails, expensive athleisure wear, and weaponized pleasantries. She saw the HOA not as a boring administrative body, but as a vehicle for her vision. And her vision involved a level of conformity that would make a drill sergeant blush. The first letter arrived on a Tuesday. It was printed on thick, cream-colored cardstock, with the HOA logo embossed at the top. It informed me that my mailbox, the simple, sturdy metal box that had been there for 30 years, was not in compliance with community aesthetic standards. I was to replace it with one of the 3 approved models. Pictures helpfully included, within 14 days or face a fine of $25 per day. I read the letter. I read the HOA covenants, all 312 pages of them, which I had of course read before I bought the house. There was indeed a clause about mailboxes. I walked outside and looked at my mailbox. It was functional. It was inoffensive. It was, however, not the specific shade of heritage black that the approved models boasted. I thought about fighting it. I thought about writing a letter citing the vagueness of the aesthetic standards clause, say. I thought about the time and energy that would take. Then I thought about Martha. She would have told me to just buy the damn mailbox. Pick your battles, Arthur, she'd say, so I went online and bought the approved mailbox. It cost $150. I installed it the following weekend. And then I did something else. I took the letter from Eleanor, the receipt for the new mailbox, and a photograph of the offending original. I put them in a manila folder. On the tab, I wrote HOA mailbox. I placed it in the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet. I had no grand plan. It was just instinct. I am a man who believes in documentation. My entire career was built on the premise that the paper trail never lies. That was the first folder. It was not the last. A month later, it was the color of my front door. A month after that, it was the fact that I had left my trash bins visible from the street for 3 hours past the approved collection window. Each time a letter would arrive, each time I would read the covenants. If the violation was legitimate, however petty, I would comply. I would pay the fine without argument. And I would add the letter, the receipt for the paint or the check for the fine to the filing cabinet. The folders began to multiply. HOA landscaping, HOA exterior maintenance, HOA fines paid. I was building a library of pettiness, a detailed archive of Eleanor Vance's reign. I kept the receipts, all of them. I also started to observe. I saw Mrs. Gable, an elderly widow who lived across the street, get a violation for her wind chimes. I saw the young family with 2 toddlers get fined because their children's plastic slide was visible over their fence line. Eleanor was an equal opportunity tyrant. She ruled by fear and by the slow grinding exhaustion of her subject. Most people like me just gave in. It was easier to pay the $25 fine than to attend a 3-hour board meeting to argue about it. It was a war of attrition, and she had an endless supply of ammunition in the form of cream-colored cardstock. The real conflict, the one that set the stage for the fire, began about a year before that night. It was about the strip of land behind my property. On paper, on the county plat maps I had studied so carefully, it was a drainage easement and a utility corridor, part of the community common area. In reality, it was a tangle of wild blackberry bushes and mature oak trees. A buffer between my quiet acre and the rest of the world. It was one of the reasons I loved the property. Eleanor decided it needed to be beautified. That was her word. She envisioned a walking path, decorative gravel, and ornamental pear trees. She unveiled her plan at a board meeting with a PowerPoint presentation full of stock photos of smiling families strolling on pristine paths. She called it the Vance Nature Walk, in a moment of hubris so profound it was almost admirable. I knew it was a terrible idea. I was a structural engineer. I understood soil stability, water runoff, and the delicate root systems of mature trees. The area was a natural swale. It was designed to collect and slowly disperse rainwater from the entire upper portion of the neighborhood. Paving it, grading it, and removing the existing vegetation would, at best, cause localized flooding. At worst, it could destabilize the entire slope, including the ground beneath my barn. This was a battle I had to pick. This wasn't a mailbox. This was fundamental. This was about physics, and physics doesn't care about aesthetic standards. My first step was to try and resolve it, quietly, professionally. On paper, I drafted a letter. It was not an angry letter, nor a threatening one. It was a technical document. In clear, simple terms, I explained the function of the drainage easement. I cited the original geotechnical survey from the developer, a copy of which I had obtained from the county planning office. I attached annotated diagrams showing the likely water flow patterns if the grading were to be altered. I outlined the potential risks: increased erosion, flooding of downstream properties, including mine, and the potential for long-term damage to the foundations of several homes, including her own. I offered my professional services, free of charge, to the association to help design a more appropriate and safer beautification plan. I didn't just email it. Email is too ephemeral. I printed 3 copies. One for the HOA's management company, and one for the board's secretary. I sent them via certified mail, return receipt requested. In my world, a green and white signature card from the USPS is a sacred object. It is proof. It is an undeniable, legally binding acknowledgement that your message was received. It transforms an opinion into a formal warning. A week later, I got the green cards back in the mail. All 3 were signed. Eleanor's signature was a flamboyant, angry scrawl. I filed the cards along with a copy of my letter in a new folder. I labeled it Drainage Easement. Her response came not in the mail, but at the next board meeting. I decided to attend, my first one ever. The meeting was held in the chilly, soulless clubhouse. About 15 people were there, the usual mix of retirees, with too much time on their hands, and a few younger couples who had been fined into attendance. Eleanor sat at the head of a long table, flanked by 2 other board members who looked like hostages. She brought up my letter during the new business portion. She didn't read it. She held it up, pinching it between 2 fingers as if it were a dirty diaper. "We have received a communication," she said, her voice dripping with disdain, "from Mr. Pendleton." All eyes turned to me, sitting in the back row. "He has some concerns about our lovely nature walk project." She then launched into a 10-minute tirade. She painted me as a crank, a killjoy, a man who wanted to deny the community its slice of paradise. She mocked my diagrams as scribbles and my professional opinion as fear-mongering. She said, and I will never forget this quote, "Some people see problems. I see pear trees, and I think I know which vision our community prefers." Her supporters, a small clique of women who seemed to be her ladies-in-waiting, applauded enthusiastically. The 2 board members, stared at the table. No one else made a sound. She never addressed a single technical point I had raised. She didn't talk about soil mechanics or water tables. She transformed a matter of engineering into a matter of loyalty. You were either for the pear trees or you were against. The community, it was a master class in misdirection. When she was finished, she looked at me, a triumphant smirk on her face. "Does Mr. Pendleton have anything to add?" I stood up. The room was silent. "Yes," I said, "just one question. For the record, has the board received a formal engineering study to assess the impact of the proposed grading on the drainage easement?" Eleanor's smirk faltered. The question was a procedural stiletto, sharp and precise. "We have consulted with our landscaping contractor," she said defensively. "He is a professional. He assures us it will be fine." "So the answer is no, you have not obtained a licensed engineering study," I stated, not as a question, but as a fact. "Thank you, that's all I have." I sat down. I had done what I came to do. I had put her on the record, in front of witnesses, admitting that she was proceeding without due diligence. I had established a bright line of negligence. The next day, a bright yellow bulldozer arrived. She had hired a contractor. The company name on the side of the rusty pickup truck that accompanied it was Vance Landscaping. The driver was a burly man in his 40s with a cigarette permanently attached to his lower lip. He worked with a kind of aggressive incompetence, herring at the earth, leaving piles of uprooted blackberry bushes and soil in unstable mounds, and so I began my new routine. I am a creature of habit. My professional life had taught me the value of systematic data collection. Every morning at 8 a.m., and every evening at 5 p.m., I would go out with my camera. It had a GPS and a timestamp function. I took wide shots, showing the scope of the work. I took close-ups of the erosion channels already starting to form after a light rain. I took pictures of his truck, his equipment, the way he stored gasoline cans, next to a pile of dry brush he was accumulating near the fence line of my property. It was a bonfire waiting for a spark. I sent a second certified letter to the board, this one with photographs, pointing out the specific safety violations and the emerging erosion. It was ignored. I filed my copy. I kept taking pictures. The pile of brush grew larger. It was now just 10 feet from the wall of my barn. I felt a familiar, professional curiosity begin to stir. Eleanor had said she'd consulted with her landscaping contractor. The name Vance Landscaping seemed a little too convenient. In my line of work, you learn there are no coincidences. So I retreated to my office. It was time to get to work. It didn't take long. Public records are a beautiful thing, a vast, searchable ocean of data for those who know how to navigate it. I started with the state's business registry. There was no Vance Landscaping listed. No business license, no incorporation papers. Nothing interesting. Next, I ran the license plate from the pickup truck. It was registered to a man named Jerry Kowalski. A quick search of social media revealed that Jerry Kowalski's wife was named Brenda, and Brenda Kowalski's maiden name was Vance. She was Eleanor's younger sister. The contractor wasn't just a contractor, he was family. This was the bombshell, the discovery that changes the entire landscape of the problem. It wasn't just negligence anymore. It was now nepotism, and a profound conflict of interest. She hadn't hired a professional, she had hired her brother-in-law. Was he qualified? I ran a search on the state's contractor licensing board. Jerry Kowalski had no license for grading, no license for landscaping, no license for anything. He was, on paper, a complete amateur. To make matters worse, I found a handful of small claims court judgments against him from other towns for shoddy work and taking deposits without finishing jobs. Eleanor Vance, president of the HOA, was using community funds to pay her unlicensed, uninsured, judgment-riddled brother-in-law to perform work for which he was not qualified, in direct violation of the HOA's own requirement that all contractors be licensed and insured. And he was doing it in a way that endangered the entire neighborhood. I carefully printed out every document. The vehicle registration, the social media pages showing the family connection, the screen captures from the licensing board, the public court records. I compiled them into a neat chronological report. I placed this report into a new, heavy-duty, fire-resistant document bag. I labeled it Exhibit A. She had no idea. She thought she was building a nature walk. But what she was really building was the case against herself. The night of the fire, after my brief conversation with Marshal Thompson, I did not sleep. I sat in my armchair, watching the dawn slowly break, casting a pale gray light on the smoking ruins in my backyard. The smell of wet ash was thick in the air. Around 7 a.m. my phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number. "Mr. Pendleton, this is Fire Marshal Thompson. I'm at my office. I'd like to hear what you have to say." "I'll be there in 30 minutes, I said. "I'll bring coffee." His office was in a sterile county building, a place of beige walls and flickering fluorescent lights. It smelled of stale coffee and bureaucracy. Thompson was sitting behind a metal desk, cluttered with reports and diagrams. He looked like he hadn't slept either. There was a large whiteboard on the wall, and on it, he'd already sketched a rough diagram of my property, the barn, and the surrounding area. He was a methodical man. I liked him immediately. I placed the 2 coffees on his desk and sat down. I didn't bring my entire archive. That would be overwhelming. You don't drown a man in data. You give him a thread and let him pull it. I brought one thing. The fire-resistant bag labeled Exhibit A. I placed it on the desk between us. "Marshal," I began, "I believe the fire in my barn was an accident. I believe it was a direct result of gross negligence. And I believe the person responsible for that negligence is currently trying to frame me for arson to cover her own tracks." Thompson leaned back, his eyes narrowing. "That's a strong accusation." "It's a well-documented one," I replied. I opened the bag. I didn't grandstand. I just laid the documents out on his desk, one by one, like a game of solitaire. "This is a copy of a certified letter I sent to the HOA board 3 weeks ago, warning them about the dangers of altering the drainage easement behind my property." I pointed to the signature on the return receipt. "This is Eleanor Vance's signature, acknowledging receipt. This," I continued, laying out a series of 8 times 10 grams glossy photos, "is the work they began the next day. Note the date and timestamps. This is the contractor they hired, a company called Vance Landscaping. Note the pile of dry brush and construction debris being stored here, approximately 10 feet from my barn wall. Note the red gasoline cans stored right next to it. This photo was taken 2 days ago." I let him study the photos. His expression was grim. He was a man who understood the physics of combustion. He knew what he was looking at. "Eleanor Vance told the deputy on the scene, and I'm sure she told you, that they had hired a professional landscaper," I said. "This is where it gets interesting." I then laid out the rest of the documents from Exhibit A. "There is no registered business named Vance Landscaping in this state. The truck belongs to this man, Jerry Kowalski. He has no contractor's license of any kind. He does, however, have a wife named Brenda. Brenda's maiden name is Vance. She is Eleanor Vance's sister. This is her brother-in-law." I placed the printout of the court judgments on top of the pile. "And he has a documented history of unprofessionalism." I leaned back in my chair. I had presented my data. The file was now in his hands. Marshal Thompson was silent for a full minute. He looked at the photos. He looked at the family tree I had essentially drawn for him. He picked up the copy of my original warning letter and read it. His lips a thin, hard line. He was a professional reading a professional's work, and I could see a glimmer of respect in his eyes. He was no longer a county official investigating a citizen. We were two experts from different fields, looking at the same set of facts. "Mr. Pendleton," he said finally, his voice low. "You're a retired structural engineer, is that right?" "Yes," I said. "Failure analysis was my specialty." He nodded slowly, a wry, tired smile touching the corner of his mouth for the first time. "I'll bet it was." He tapped the pile of documents. "This is a good start. A very good start. I'm going to need to talk to Mr. Kowalski. I'm also going to need to talk to the other members of the HOA board. And I'm going to need a warrant for the HOA's financial records." He stood up, extending his hand. "Thank you for the coffee, and for your thoroughness." "Just doing my civic duty," I said, shaking his hand. As I walked out of the building, my phone buzzed. It was a community-wide email from Eleanor Vance. The subject line read, "Wargent, E-Gent update on the suspicious fire, and a call for community vigilance." In the email, she doubled down. She hinted at a disturbed and litigious individual in our midst and announced an emergency community meeting to discuss additional security measures and potential legal action. I smiled. It was exactly what I had expected. When a structure is failing, it often groans and creaks, making a lot of noise before it comes down. Eleanor was starting to groan. She had no idea that the foundation of her little kingdom had just been condemned. The investigation moved at the speed of government, which is to say, slowly, but with a grinding inevitability. Marshal Thompson was as good as his word. 2 days after our meeting, his car and a sheriff's vehicle were parked in front of Jerry Kowalski's house. Jerry, it turned out, was a man who did not handle pressure well. Faced with a fire marshal asking pointed questions about fuel storage and a sheriff's deputy asking about his business license, he crumbled. He admitted everything. He said he'd been using an angle grinder to cut some old metal fence posts near the brush pile. A spark must have jumped. He didn't notice it at first. When he did, he panicked, grabbed his tools, and fled. He never called 911. He just called his sister-in-law, Eleanor. Eleanor's reaction was predictable. Instead of accepting responsibility, she went on the offensive. The emergency community meeting was her chosen battlefield. She booked the clubhouse and sent out a flurry of emails, framing the meeting as a chance for the community to stand together against threats both internal and external. She was trying to rally her base to use social pressure as a shield against the facts that were slowly closing in on her. This is when the first crack in her wall appeared. It came in the form of a quiet knock on my front door. It was Mrs. Gable, the widow from across the street, the one with the wind chimes. She was a tiny woman, bird-like and frail, and she looked terrified. She was clutching an old shoebox to her chest as if it were a life-preserver. "Mr. Pendleton," she whispered, looking over her shoulder. "Can I come in for a moment?" I led her into the kitchen. She wouldn't sit down. She just stood in the middle of the room, her hands trembling. "I saw the marshal's car at Jerry's house," she said. "I read Eleanor's email. What she's doing, it's not right. What she did to you, what she's done to all of us." She opened the shoebox and placed it on my kitchen table. It was filled with letters, dozens of them. All on the same cream-colored cardstock I knew so well. Violations for her bird feeder, attracts vermin. For a small crack in her driveway, trip hazard and eyesore. For her flowers, exceeding the 18-inch height limit. It was a chronicle of a decade of harassment. But at the bottom of the box was something else. It was a cassette tape. A microcassette, the kind used in old dictation machines. My husband, before he passed, he was the board secretary, she explained. He recorded all the meetings, just for his notes. He was a stickler for accuracy. Eleanor hated. She pointed to the tape. This is from a closed session meeting last year, right after you sent your first letter about the drainage ditch. I wasn't supposed to have it. But Charles, he was so upset. After that meeting, he told me what she said. My heart rate quickened. A recording. A recording was the Holy Grail. It was unimpeachable. What did she say, Mrs. Gable? She said, Mrs. Gable's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. Don't worry about that engineer and his letters. He thinks he's so smart. I'll get him. I'll find a way to make this place so uncomfortable for him he'll have to sell. If he wants to play hardball, he has no idea who he's messing with. I will bury him in fines and violations until he's gone. Charles wrote it down verbatim. He was so angry. I looked at the tiny cassette tape. It was worth more than 1,000 photographs. It was motive. It was malice aforethought. It was Eleanor, in her own voice, declaring her intentions. Mrs. Gable? I said, my voice thick with a gratitude I could barely express. You are a very brave woman. Tears welled in her eyes. No, she said, I was a coward, for years. You're the one who's brave, for standing up to her. I want to be on the right side of things, for Charles. The day after Mrs. Gable's visit, I received a phone call. It was David Chen, the youngest member of the HOA board. He was a tech guy in his 30s, quiet, and usually looked overwhelmed at the meetings. He was one of the hostages at Eleanor's table. Mr. Pendleton, he said, his voice tense. I need to talk to you. I'm resigning from the board. Effective immediately. What Eleanor is doing is wrong. The Marshal's office contacted me. I told them the truth. That we never voted to approve her brother-in-law. She just did it. She called it an emergency expenditure and used the president's discretionary fund. She lied to us. She lied to everyone. He took a deep breath. The meeting she's called. It's a sham. She's going to propose a massive special assessment to pay for the legal defense of the HOA against your frivolous claims. She's going to use our money to defend herself from the consequences of her own actions. Thank you for telling me, David, I said, and thank you for telling the Marshal the truth. There's more, he said. I'll testify to it. At the meeting where she mocked your letter, after you left, she told the rest of us that you were a pompous old fool, and that she was going to make an example of you. Mrs. Gable's husband wasn't the only one who heard it. I heard it too. The coalition was forming. The fearful ally, the disillusioned insider. The pieces were falling into place. Eleanor, in her panic, was making my case for me. Her final desperate escalation, the special assessment, was not a show of strength, but the last gasp of a tyrant who had lost control of the narrative. The community she thought she owned was beginning to remember it was a community, not a kingdom. And the meeting she had called to be her coronation would, instead, be her tribunal. The night of the meeting, the clubhouse was packed. I had never seen so many people at an HOA event. It felt less like a community gathering and more like the lead-up to a prize fight. The air was thick with tension and the cheap scent of the plug-in air fresheners Eleanor favored. She had arranged the chairs theater-style, facing the long table where she and the two remaining board members sat. A large screen and a projector stood off to one side, ready for her presentation. Her supporters, the same coterie of women from before, occupied the front rows, a phalanx of suburban loyalty. The rest of the room was a sea of unfamiliar and anxious faces, people who had been roused from their quiet lives by the email about a special assessment. I arrived with Mrs. Gable on my arm. Her presence was a statement. I had also hired legal counsel, a sharp young woman from a downtown firm who specialized in property law. She wasn't my old colleague. This wasn't a job for a friend. This was a job for a professional. She carried a sleek laptop bag and had the calm, predatory stillness of a panther. We took seats in the back. Our arrival caused a ripple of whispers. Eleanor, from her perch at the front, shot me a look of pure venom. She began the meeting with a gavel strike that cracked like a rifle shot. She dispensed with the usual pleasantries and launched directly into her performance. It was a masterpiece of revisionist history and feigned victimhood. She spoke of her tireless, unpaid service to the community. She spoke of her grand vision for the nature walk, a vision that had been sabotaged by negativity and baseless accusations. Then, she turned to the fire. Her voice dropped, taking on a tremulous emotional quality. "A terrible tragedy occurred," she said, dabbing at a dry eye with a tissue. "A fire that has shaken our peaceful community. And in the wake of this tragedy, instead of unity, we have been met with suspicion, with lawsuits, with an attempt to tear our community apart for personal gain." She didn't use my name, but she didn't have to. Every eye in the room flickered towards me. Now the board is facing unprecedented legal challenges. We have been advised that we need to retain a top-tier law firm to protect the interests of our association, to protect your property values, and that, unfortunately, requires a special one-time assessment of $500 per household. A gasp went through the room. $500. "This is to defend us," she said, her voice rising, "against the person who, through his own actions or negligence, has brought this chaos upon us." She was pointing at me now, her whole body trembling with manufactured rage. "The person whose barn burned down under highly suspicious circumstances." My lawyer put a hand on my arm, a silent command to stay seated. This was the moment. Eleanor had made her accusation, publicly and without reservation. "Point of order, Madam President." The voice was calm and clear. It was David Chen, the former board member. He was standing near the side wall. Eleanor glared at him. "You are no longer on the board, David. You have no voice here." "As a homeowner, I have a voice," he retorted. "And since this assessment is being proposed to cover legal fees related to an investigation in which I am a witness, I believe my testimony is relevant." He looked out at the crowd. "I resigned from the board because President Vance lied to us. She did not get board approval to hire her brother-in-law. She used discretionary funds in a way that violated our bylaws. She ignored multiple written warnings about the safety of the project. And when Mr. Pendleton, a professional engineer, tried to warn us, she told the board in a closed session, and I quote, that she would bury him in fines until he's gone. This assessment isn't to protect the community. It's to protect Eleanor Vance from the consequences of her own malice." The room erupted. Eleanor banged her gavel, screaming for order, but she had lost control. Mrs. Gable, emboldened, stood up. "She's been bullying us for years," she cried, her voice surprisingly strong. "I have a box full of her threatening letters. This isn't about property values, it's about her power." Into this chaos my lawyer stood up. She walked calmly to the front of the room. "My name is Jessica Riley," she said, her voice cutting cleanly through the noise. "I represent Mr. Arthur Pendleton. And we would also like to address the community." Eleanor, her face pale and blotchy, sputtered, "This is a private meeting. You have no right." "It ceased to be a private meeting when you publicly accused my client of a crime and proposed a $500 assessment based on that accusation," Miss Riley said smoothly. "We believe the homeowners deserve to have all the relevant facts before they vote. With your permission, we'd like to use your projector." She didn't wait for an answer. She simply unplugged Eleanor's laptop and plugged in her own. The first image that flashed on the screen was a high-resolution scan of my first certified letter. The second was the signed receipt, with Eleanor's signature magnified to fill the screen. Then came the photos. The daily time-stamped progression of the worksite. The brush pile growing. The gas cans. The erosion. The pictures were clinical, objective, and damning. With each click of the mouse, another nail was hammered into Eleanor's narrative. Then, a new slide. The Contractor, a picture of Jerry Kowalski from his social media page, standing next to his sister-in-law, Eleanor Vance, at a family barbecue. Then the screenshot from the state licensing board, no license found. Then, the list of his small claims court judgments. The room was dead silent now. The mask was slipping from Eleanor's face. Her look of righteous indignation was being replaced by a blank, frozen panic. She was realizing far too late the depth of her miscalculation. She was a performer who had just forgotten all her lines, realizing the audience knew the real story all along. And finally, Miss Riley said, her voice soft but carrying to every corner of the room. The night of the fire, she played the audio file. The tiny, tinny sound of the microcassette was digitally cleaned up. Eleanor's voice, full of venom and arrogance, filled the clubhouse. "I'll get him. I'll find a way. I will bury him in fines." The collapse was not dramatic. It was quiet. Eleanor Vance didn't scream or cry or faint. She just deflated. The rigid posture, the defiant chin, the furious energy, all evaporated. She sank into her chair, her face a ghastly shade of white. She stared at the screen, at her own transcribed words, as if she were seeing a ghost. The performative tyrant had been stripped of her costume and her script, and there was nothing left underneath. She had built her kingdom on a foundation of bluff and bluster. And I had just shown everyone the blueprints. It was hollow. And it was falling. The aftermath was swift and comprehensive. The vote on the special assessment never happened. The meeting dissolved into a flurry of angry questions, directed not at me, but at the crumbling figure of Eleanor Vance and her two remaining stunned board members. My lawyer, Miss Cuff. Riley simply packed up her laptop, gave me a crisp nod, and left. Her work was done. The truth, once properly presented, is its own advocate. Marshal Thompson's final report was a model of bureaucratic clarity. It officially listed the cause of the fire as accidental, resulting from the negligent use of power tools in proximity to flammable materials by an unlicensed and uninsured contractor. Jerry Kowalski was charged with reckless endangerment and several violations of state contracting law. Faced with the evidence, he pleaded guilty to a lesser charge, received a hefty fine, and was sentenced to 2 years of probation. His landscaping career was over. The legal consequences for Eleanor were more complex and, in a way, more satisfying. The district attorney declined to press criminal charges for filing a false report, citing the difficulty of proving intent over panic stupidity. However, the state insurance commissioner's office was very interested. They launched an investigation into the HOA's insurance policies and Eleanor's actions. It turned out she had, in the hours after the fire, tried to file a claim on the HOA's general liability policy to cover the damage to my barn, listing the cause as unknown. When they cross-referenced that with her statements to the 911 operator and the sheriff's deputy, accusing me of arson, they saw it for what it was: a clumsy attempt at insurance fraud. She was trying to get the HOA's insurer to pay for her brother-in-law's mistake while simultaneously framing me. The investigation is ongoing. But the word felony has been used. Socially, her downfall was absolute. A recall petition was circulated the day after the meeting. It got more than enough signatures in under 48 hours. A new board was elected, with David Chen as the interim president. Their first act was to formally rescind every fine Eleanor had issued in the past 2 years that couldn't be directly supported by a clear, unambiguous violation of the covenants. Checks started going out. Mrs. Burr, Gable got a refund for her wind chimes. The family with the plastic slide got their money back. It was a tax rebate on tyranny. The Vance Nature Walk project was abandoned. The new board used reserve funds to hire a proper civil engineering firm, my recommendation A, to remediate the damage Jerry had done. They stabilized the slope, planted appropriate native vegetation, and restored the drainage easement to its original functional state. It wasn't as pretty as pear trees, but it was safe. It worked. My own insurance company, once they received a copy of the fire marshal's report and my file of documentation, was a dream to work with. They paid my claim without a single quibble. They even sent a senior adjuster to my house to personally commend me on the quality of my record-keeping. They then turned around and subrogated the claim against Eleanor and Jerry personally, as their actions fell far outside the protections of the HOA's liability insurance. The last I heard, her executive model home had a massive lien on it. She was going to be paying for that fire for a very long time on paper. A few weeks after the climactic meeting, Mrs. Gable knocked on my door again. This time, she wasn't carrying a shoebox of secrets. She was carrying a freshly baked apple pie. "For the brave man," she said, with a smile that reached her eyes. We sat on my porch, the one where I had stood and watched the fire, and we ate pie and drank coffee as the sun went down. Other neighbors, people I had only ever waved to from a distance, started stopping by. Some just to say hello, some to thank me. Mr. Henderson, the man in the bathrobe from the night of the fire, shook my hand and said, "We all knew she was a bully. We just didn't know how to fight her. You showed us." I was no longer the strange recluse at the end of the cul-de-sac. I was the man who had slain the dragon, not with a sword, but with a filing cabinet. I stand on my porch now, in the quiet of the evening, and look out at the empty space where the barn once stood. The charred foundation has been cleared. The ground is level and covered in fresh straw. For a while I considered just planting grass, leaving it as a scar, a reminder. But the task's not my way. A failure is not an end. It is an opportunity to learn, to rebuild, to do it better. Inside, on my desk, is a new folder. ETOS thick and already filling up. It contains soil analysis reports, architectural sketches, and quotes from builders all licensed and insured. Of course, I'm designing the new barn myself. It will be stronger. It will have a state-of-the-art fire suppression system. The beams will be steel, wrapped in reclaimed wood to honor the memory of the old structure. It will be a testament not to what was lost, but to what can be built in its place. The Folderis tab is simple. It does not say revenge or vindication. It just says, barn, new plans. It has a quiet place. My home order has been restored, and I have the receipts to prove it.